Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the opening remarks, and it's time to get the panel discussions going. Our first panel discussion will focus on Eastern Partnership and will focus on the question if it has accomplished its objectives in getting the region more squarely on a path towards European integration, or has its impact been only incremental in nature? I'm glad to invite onto the stage the moderator of this panel, Mrs. Riina Kionka, Chief Foreign Policy Advisor to the President of the European Council. Very happy to see you in Tallinn, Riina.
Good morning.
Before you start, can I just ask one question, because I do like to ask questions as a journalist. Yeah.
Keep going.
Well, you've been a Brussels insider for 14 years, right? Have a seat, please.
So they say, yes.
Yeah. Could you take us back to the days when Eastern Partnership was still, discussed as a concept around 2008? What were the expectations and challenges seen in Brussels at that time?
2008 was a good, 10 years ago, 11 years ago. I think there were a few key sort of elements that were governing what people's thinking was about this area of the world. Specifically, the war in Georgia had just happened. It really had a way of focusing energy, focusing people's minds. The other thing was the post sort of 2004 enlargement and the 2007 enlargement. Those had just happened, and so there was a certain degree of, I think, dare I say, fatigue. If Georgia wasn't a wake-up call, then just a year later or so, we had, or 2 years later, we had the reset in the United States. So there was a kind of ambivalent reaction to how we should read, how we should interpret what happened in Georgia. And finally, we were just 1 or 2 years into the multi-annual financial framework of 2007-2013. And I mention this, it seems technical, I mention it because it's really key, I believe, to the success of the Eastern Partnership, which we will discuss now. So I'm not trying to lean one way or another here, but the idea that a certain pot of money should go in a certain direction, I think this has been key to the policy itself. So I think those were the kinds of thoughts that were bubbling about.
Were there a lot of skeptics saying that no, you shouldn't even consider this policy option?
Of course there were, but this was also intended to a little bit balance the stress that up to that time in the neighborhood policy had been toward the south, and there was a real need, a growing sort of awareness of the idea that there was a need to look also to the east. So voila.
I'm not going to keep you any longer, Riina. Thank you very much.
Please, thank you very much, Johannes, and could I invite the panel to join me on the stage? I think everybody's wired up already. You can come here.
Thank you. Where do you want this?
Wherever. Thank you. And let me begin by welcoming everybody to this very first panel of the conference. Panel 1 is dedicated to looking at what's happened in the past 10 years. We will have a panel later in the day that is looking toward the future. So I've asked the panelists to think about the past and avoid the seductive idea of looking toward the future in this very first panel. We're trying to make a sort of figure out where we are 10 years on. If we look 10 years back, or even a little bit more, then in 2002, in an oft-quoted phrase, then European Commission President Romano Prodi introduced a new European neighborhood policy by referring to the need to create everything but institutions. This everything but institutions became a kind of catchphrase. And it was just a few years later, 6 years later to be exact, when a magical moment occurred where we had 2 foreign ministers in the European, in the Council's Foreign Affairs Committee who had a vision, had an idea, and also had the wherewithal and the political drive to make this happen. And we'll hear a little bit more about that. 10 years is a long time. 10 years is especially a long time in this part of the world. It's fair to say, I think, that 10 years ago, when Georgia was hit by the 2008 war and Russian troops were marching close to Tbilisi, very few people in Europe, to say nothing of outside Europe, had any idea where Georgia was on the map. Now that has all changed. That has all changed in 10 years. And I say Georgia, but Georgia here is a metaphor for the rest of the countries in the region as well. This has changed profoundly. In 10 years, the geographic distance between this part of the world and the European Union has diminished. How can you diminish a geographic distance? Well, I think we've done that quite successfully in Estonia, so it can be done. But I wonder, is this one of the major accomplishments of the Eastern Partnership? Today, there's more Ukraine in Europe and more Europe in Ukraine than there ever was before. There's more Armenia in Europe and more Europe and Armenia than there was 10 years ago. Can we write this to the account as well of the Eastern Partnership? It's a question. So in other words, when the Eastern Partnership was born, and this is how we'll start with the panel, when it was born, was it a star that was born, or was it just another set of measures repackaged to look kind of sexy and kind of new and to be more sellable? That's the real question that we're considering here in this panel as we look back to 10 years. So we have a terrific panel, very representative, to discuss the past. We have Minister Natsankanyan from Armenia, who has served as Armenia's permanent representative to the UN both in New York and Geneva, and was the chief negotiator for the association agreement. We have Ms. Stefanishna from Ukraine, who has spent her career focused on Euro-Atlantic integration at the Ministry of Justice, at the Vice Prime Minister's office, and now as the Director General of the Government Department for that goal. We have Ambassador Kozlowski of Poland, a career diplomat who has served in the Polish delegation to NATO, has worked on a lot of energy and economic issues through the years, and those are certainly very pertinent to the Eastern Partnership. And we have Ambassador Westerholm of Sweden, who has worked on this part of the world just about from the time she joined the Foreign Ministry some years ago, and she's worked on it in various capacities, including as an analyst for the Swedish Armed Forces. So bringing the security aspect in there as well. So how we will work this panel is that each of the panelists will have a few minutes to introduce their thoughts. Then we'll have a discussion amongst the panelists, and then we will turn it over to you. So get your questions ready, and with no further ado, Minister, the chair is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. And of course, first of all, I just join in thanking Estonia for the very committed, effort to promote the concept and the policies of Eastern Partnership. I really thank the Romanian presidency in the European Union for taking it up, the Eastern Partnership visibility in their priorities as presidency in the European Union, and all of you for the continued interest in this very important subject. Now, the question I think I was addressing it is: has it all started 10 years ago? That the platform for what are known today Eastern partners has been created to work in the direction of Europe. I think Eastern Partnership, in that sense, is this new, additional, and very important platform, new opportunity to continue with what, at least so far as Armenia is concerned, what we have been building for 27 years in building a model, building a country, building institutions according to the European model. We had a very bumpy road. We had various degree of record in this. I represent today a government who can very confidently claim that it is this institutional capacity of the nation created over 27 years that we were able to go through a very important phase of the Velvet Revolution in April and May 2018. And it is part of what was happening in the country over the past 27 years. Eastern Partnership, in that sense, was an important platform to work with. We work with Europe at a bilateral level. I am here for a bilateral visit to Estonia, and we have an extraordinary agenda to work together to promote bilateral issues also within the context of what we do together in Europe and in the context of developing those relations in the context of European values. We have an important relationship with the European Union as such. The fundamental basis of our relationship today is the CEPA, the Comprehensive and Enhanced Partnership Agreement. And then we have been great beneficiaries of this additional platform, which is the Eastern Partnership. Now, I think I would want to look at Eastern Partnership for the past 10 years in two dimensions. First, it is this recognition of the pragmatic approach to enhance the cooperation amongst the partners and the European Union and to penetrate as deeply as possible the various fields, the various aspects of life in our respective countries and in cooperation with the European Union partners. The Brussels summit in that context was very useful. The Brussels Declaration is a demonstration of pragmatism in Eastern Partnership approaches. It is not just a matter of governments to talk to each other, but over these 10 years, there are very important other platforms to engage our societies. The Business Forum, and I'm really very glad to hear that there will be another important business forum during the Romanian chairmanship. In fact, the fourth business platform, as I find out, was here in Tallinn in 2017. There is very important focus on digital economies and cooperation in the field of digitalization. There is cooperation towards engaging our societies. For us, the civil society is a fundamentally important partner in Armenia, and I'm really glad that we work together at our national platform, but also within the platform, within the context of the EaP platform. Youth, an absolutely important area to engage. Again, penetration to those various layers of our societies, to engage them and to make it a common agenda for all. So this is very important. The other dimension of Eastern Partnership is, what kind of partnership is that? Is it a partnership of 28 members of the European Union with 6 partners? There has always been a challenge about taking it beyond the perception of Eastern Partnership as a partnership between the Eastern European members of the European Union and the Eastern partners. Or, in fact, the biggest challenge, I think, the important challenge here is to recognize the aspect of common values, common European identity at the heart of such partnership. So is it Eastern Partnership or is European Partnership? European Partnership, which is beyond 28 plus 6, beyond the total of 34, because there are others in Europe as well. So recognizing Eastern Partnership or this area as part of the broader Eastern European identity, I think is one of the important challenges before the Eastern Partnership that has been haunting, challenging us throughout these 10 years, and I think an issue that we would need to address in the next phase, in the next 10 years of such partnership. Those are, I think, the introductory part of what I might want to say, and certainly looking forward to the interesting debate. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Minister. So we have heard now from an Eastern partner who is not an association agreement, DCFTA partner, and you see it as a pragmatic way forward, but you posed the question, a very interesting question that I would like to pose to Ms. Stefanichnia as the representative of an association agreement, DCFTA member, and that is the Eastern Partnership a question or a policy for the whole EU, or is it more something that the eastern part of the EU has been pushing? So, please.
Well, actually, the discussions we have already had today recollected a lot of interesting facts in the past years of Ukrainian history and its history moving for European integration. You must have been aware that Ukraine wasn't very much passionate about being a part of the Eastern Partnership Initiative at the very beginning, because at the moment when Eastern Partnership was established, Ukraine have already concluded the negotiations on the association agreement, which back in 2007 was also called the new Enhanced Partnership and Cooperation Agreement. So we have already transformed our approach from the partnership and cooperation towards deep and comprehensive free trade area, and we were more adjusting ourselves to those countries who already have the perspective of membership, and also to EEA countries who have already a very strong links on economic cooperation. So you must be able to recollect in your memory the statements from Ukrainian officials 10 years ago that Ukraine is not the appropriate participant of Eastern Partnership. Ukraine shall be treated separately and uniquely. And this is the discussions which have already transformed also itself in the course of 10 years when Ukraine does not really go into this discussion whether what is the role of Ukraine in the Eastern Partnership. So we have the Eastern Partnership format of cooperation with the European Union and the bilateral dialogue with the European Union in terms of association agreement and in terms of political and security support towards Ukrainian territorial integrity and sovereignty. And from time to time, one of these dialogues prevails. So far, if we are looking back for today's agenda, of course, bilateral dialogue is more privileged to Ukraine because we're going deeply into implementation of the association agreement. And to look back into this agreement, you will see that this is the Ukrainian agreement is the most ambitious one which have ever been signed by European Union with a third country which is not the candidate. Because looking into the substance, you can see that the scope of this agreement is very close to EEA countries, is very close to Baltic association and even sometimes accession agreements. And this is something which clearly distinguishes us for the format of cooperation. But also looking back to the Eastern Partnership in the course of the last 2 years, we can believe and recollect in our memories that it has started more focused on very political dialogue, and the most successful discussions were on a political fora on democracy, rule of law, and values. And now when we're looking into the substance of the deliverables 20 to 20, which allowed us to structure our dialogue, we're more focused on very pragmatic and realistic things which would allow us to bring our partners closer together. And I'm not talking about the EU member states, but also about Eastern Partnership countries. This is something which goes to transport links, logistics, energy, digital issues, which are not binding and does not oblige us to conclude any formal agreement, but which allows us to enhance our cooperation and build on the existing infrastructures on the multilateral format. And it's a great pleasure for me also to hear from the presidency in the European Council that the Eastern Partnership is still in focus, and it has also been in focus of, within the Estonian presidency. And I heard from one of the speakers that Eastern Partnership from the very beginning was a very good for the policy initiatives from the European Union. But I can also add that Eastern Partnership have been also very much addressive towards the policy initiatives from Eastern Partnership countries. And this is something which allowed us to boost the digital cooperation and to talk about integration of digital markets. And it also allowed us to go into transport cooperation and to form the TNT investment plan. And this is something which was built upon the initiatives of the Eastern Partnership countries and was supported by European Union. And one of my Romanian actually colleagues says a good phrase that 10 years ago, when Ukraine was willing for money, European Union suggested values. And now when Ukraine is willing for values, European Union suggests money. And actually, Eastern Partnership is a good platform also for management of the assistance and mobilizing and fundraising the resources needed also to implement the association agreement. But for us, it's also a huge network of experience, knowledges, not only between member states, but also between Eastern Partnership countries. And we're actually happy that Eastern Partnership allow us not to make some mistakes and to learn it from those countries who are also going through public administration reforms, are going through reforms of judiciary, and are also implementing specific association agreements. So it's good that Eastern Partnership have become a forum for that. But also, this is about the positive, I would say, part of the Eastern Partnership, but also Ukraine can also say that to some extent we have become geographical hostage of this initiative, because we treat it as a very good platform, but European Union is treating Eastern Partnership as a very specific geographical format for political dialogue, for political cooperation, for partnership, for enhanced partnership, while legally Ukrainian association agreement goes far beyond only partnership. It's about economic integration. It's about being a part of all 4 EU freedoms. And Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova have already become a part of EU freedom for movement of persons. And actually those mechanisms which are in the association agreement towards integration of markets, going into setting up the single electricity and gas networks, markets, being a part of digital single market, being a part of Schengen acquis, and et cetera, and huge number of initiatives, does not allow us go beyond this partnership and cooperation format. And this is something which should really be tackled and addressed also by European Commission, because a lot of experience we can learn from the Baltic countries, from the EA countries, and these are the countries whose relations are built not only on partnership, cooperation, and political dialogue, but also on a very strong economic links and economic integration. And that's why Ukraine should also go beyond this political framework and not treat it geographically as like you're from Eastern Partnership, go there and use this instrument. So we should also be treated as a fully fledged economic partner, and those institutional instruments should be applied by European Commission as well. But it also, looking back to the perspective and to those very turbulent political situations which Ukraine and all Europe and all the world faced in course of events in 2008 in Georgia, and moreover in 2014 when in Ukraine we had Euromaidan. A lot of people have put in their lives towards Ukrainian European future. Now that's where I refer to the values that we really preserve. And coming back to Ukraine, you will find not that much Europeans, which would be that pro-European, the Ukrainians actually. And we all have to also enhance our efforts towards cooperation on the security matters. And I'm not like even talking about military cooperation and something related to weapon, but we all now very oftenly using the words hybrid threats, cyber attacks, propaganda. And this is something all our countries have to share between each other. So even though we were requested not to look into the future, putting the line over my presentation, I would say that this should also be the focus for the future.
Thank you very much. And I think it's fair. This is you're doing your job. This is your 15 minutes of fame, and you have to make your points. But some of the points were fairly, I think, expressive of some frustration that we hear from some of the, if we can say, front-runner Eastern partners on why the transformational aspect of the partnership is not taken into account more broadly. And I know that you wanted Ambassador Westerholm to speak about also the transformational power. I think that would be a good time also to take that up, because I sense we're going to have a lot of debate later. So please, you have the floor.
All right. Thank you very much. I was prepared to speak last, actually, but fine. I will allow myself, I think, to take on a little bit more of philosophical perspective on this partnership. And to start by saying a few obvious facts that we all know. And the first one would be that reforming a society is not easy. And I would say that we all in this room, we know that from our own experiences. There are no shortcuts, right? And there are no quick fixes. And there is certainly no one size fits all. So, and those of you who know me, you will have heard me say this before, but development and change is not a linear process. You know, it's like a dance. You take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And the fact of the matter is, when we look at the Eastern partner countries, is that there is still a lot to be done. Now, having said that, I am convinced that we are truly in a much better place today than we were, was it not for, where we would have been, was it not for the Eastern Partnership. And I will try to expand a little bit on this. You heard my foreign minister in her video message say that the Eastern Partnership has transformational power, real transformational power. And I want to recall at the outset here the reason or the aim of the Eastern Partnership, which is, and I quote, to promote partner countries' economic integration and political association with the European Union. And I think that what we have seen during these 10 years is groundbreaking, not to say revolutionary. A groundbreaking development has happened in the region since the Eastern Partnership was launched. Because if you look back, I think that in a completely different way than the European neighborhood policy previously managed, the Eastern Partnership has actually made a shift in the emphasis of our cooperation with partner countries towards the European Union. If you look at it, we are now talking about EU standards and EU ways of doing business. Both in the multilateral track and in the bilateral tracks, we have to varying degrees, and of course for varying degrees for different countries. Both these tracks have contributed to the fact that we now discuss and we negotiate and we make decisions largely based on a common ground, which is the EU's way of functioning. So this is the outset for all our discussions today. And if you look at, from the European Union perspective, the Eastern Partnership is really key to creating a reason for us to regularly recurring discussions at all levels on a positive and on a development-oriented agenda for the region, while prior to the Eastern Partnership, actually, such ground was lacking. And the discussions that we had, most of the time at least, about partner countries was much more focused on problems, and they were crisis-oriented. It was, to a larger extent, a reactive agenda, not a proactive discussion. So I am at least convinced that the Eastern Partnership has contributed to the fact that the EU's collaborative offer, in both the depth and in the breadth, had developed more rapidly than what would otherwise have been the case. And actually, this also applies to Ukraine. So as you pointed out, due to its bilateral weight, you had much more far-reaching cooperation with the European Union than the others had before the Eastern Partnership. But the Eastern Partnership has contributed to gathering all the European member states around a common policy for the region. And as my minister said, and many others have said, that this is really one of the European Union's most successful foreign policy initiatives. So finally, I will not speak very long. I think we will come back to some questions. So let me just finally say that despite the very tough discussions that we actually have on strategy and the overall goal and on issues concerning the partner countries, I think that the incremental development of the Eastern Partnership means that European member states actually agree on cooperation with partner countries to a much higher degree than before. And this fact is often and easily missed, as we, and I will look now also at the media, where we have them, we tend to focus on crisis. And we tend to focus on issues where we disagree. But I think that it's very important that we actually, from time to time, and especially a year like this, when we are here to celebrate the 10-year anniversary of the Eastern Partnership, that we actually turn the perspective around. And when we do that, I'm convinced that we would find that the real novelty here is rather on how much we actually do agree. And my point would be that this would not have happened without the Eastern Partnership.
Thank you very much. So this is the Swedish answer to the question, to the counterfactual. Where would we be now had there been no Eastern Partnership at all? Ambassador Westerholm has made a strong case for the transformational power of the relationship, of the policy, which is parallel, in fact, to the developments of the European Union's own development, step by step, through boring, technical, sort of regulatory harmonization. A kind of union, a political union was born, and that wasn't maybe the intent, but that's what happened. Go ahead.
No.
I'm
happy to continue on the counterfactual afterwards. I actually could go more in depth on that as well.
Well, I mean, these are big and these are philosophical questions, as you said. Ambassador, was that in the mind of Radek Sikorski and Carl Bildt when they came up with this genial idea?
Thank you very much, Rina. And first of all, I would like to congratulate Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Estonia for organizing for the 6th time already this Eastern Conference, and also for grounding very well the priorities of Eastern Partnership in your foreign policy, which was reflected very well during your presidency in the second half of 2017. I would like to touch 4 points, starting with the beginning, because I think that we need a little bit of history. We all know that the initiative was introduced in 2008, and it was launched in 2009, but it didn't begin, in fact, in vacuum, because already in 2003, Poland, at that time non-member of the European Union, presented a document called Eastern Dimension of Europe, which was directed mostly to the Ukraine aspiration to the European Union. It was dropped very fast, but the same year, European Commission, as we remember, presented a document on wider European neighborhood, a new framework with our eastern and southern neighbors, which was in fact the basis for next year establishing the new initiative in the European Union, which was the European Neighborhood Policy dedicated for the 10 Mediterranean countries and the 6 eastern countries, in fact those countries who are right now the members of the Eastern Partnership. And of course, the emotions or sentiments vis-à-vis this European neighborhood policy, at least to the partners from the East, fluctuated. I mean, there were a lot of positive emotions, especially after the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. But those positive emotions soon evaporated, and Poland and also other countries from the regions, Baltic states, Visegrad 4, were thinking about trying to find a momentum to bring some kind of initiative or institution back to the European Union agenda. And the reasons behind it for Poland was quite obvious. I mean, A, we wanted to institutionalize the process of bringing as close as possible Eastern Partnership countries into the Euro-Atlantic area. Of course, as close as possible did not necessarily mean the same for some of the countries which had clearly pro-European aspirations, some of them not wanted only to remove visas or other barriers. B, of course, we wanted to create an institution which would be responsive or resilient to external pressure out of EaP, out of European Union. I mean, take a look on the 2008, the beginning of that year, very special momentum in the history of our region, just before the Bucharest summit in NATO, when the aspirations of Ukraine and Georgia were discussed, and soon, months before the invasion of Georgia by Russia. C, of course, we pursued to exchange experiences with the Eastern European countries because we wanted to, in fact, sell certain experiences from our side. First of all, because of the transformation processes in Poland in the 90s and the beginning of the 21st century, and I think that we had a good reason to send those experiences to those countries. And second, of course, our experiences with other countries from the region of the membership in the European Union. So this was in a positive sense to create a situation, positive emotions within those countries, at least some of them, which were having European aspirations, to be in some kind of a competitive race to be closer to the European Union. And D, also it was a confirmation of the Polish position as an advocate of the European partnership countries vis-à-vis both the European Union and the United States. And let me give you 2 examples. The first one, the role of the President Kaczynski in Georgia, just after the invasion of Georgia by Russia, and a strong presence over there. And also the role of Minister of Foreign Affairs Sikorski vis-à-vis Ukraine. Before, in fact, establishing the Normandy format, there were discussions in a little bit wider format, including Poland, Italy, also international organizations, and the United States. There were a lot of video conferences, discussions, how to help Ukraine and how to be responsive to the Russian aggression. But of course, the key question was how to do it, because on one hand, we were having the support from Baltic states, including Estonia and the V4 and other countries from the region. But the key was elsewhere. The first issue was that we were having great friends from Sweden. Strong, predictable, long member of the European Union, Northern European countries, and very supportive with regard to bringing those Eastern European countries into the Euro-Atlantic area. Number 2, France. But here, it was a reciprocity mechanism because France was interested in establishing Union for Mediterranean. So our support, French support, it was some kind of a common of interests. And last but not least, of course, Germany, which was for, I would say, a reasonable pace with regard to the bringing of the Eastern European countries into the Euro-Atlantic area. So this was my first point. The second point would be deliverables. And we have to say, first of all, that EaP is a successful instrument, well placed in the European Union agenda. We have built quite a good framework composed of biannual summits, annual ministers' meeting, 4 thematic platforms, flagship initiatives, and other issues, but also a separate basket in the European budgetary horizon, which is very important to keep it for the next 7 years. B, of course, it was already mentioned, we have concluded several agreements, including association and free trade agreements with Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova, EU-Armenia Comprehensive and Enhanced Partnership Agreement. We are currently negotiating EU-Belarus partnership priorities and EU-Azerbaijan framework agreement, and of course, liberalization of visas. C, the European Union is already the biggest trade partner for the European for the Eastern Partnership countries, with the exception of Belarus, which is the second. We are definitely trying to strengthen it, and we are hoping that after the trade, the investment will follow, and already the European Union has launched this external investment plan which provides entrepreneurs willing to invest with financial support. And D, of course, we contributed greatly to the Eastern Partnership countries. Only Poland for the last 10 years spent more than 350 million euros for the assistance programs to these countries. Most of this money, 1/3, went to Ukraine. And we can take a look on the Eastern Partnership also, comparing this initiative vis-à-vis Union for Mediterranean, and I think that we have positive, I would say, positive answers to that. My third and last point would be that, of course, we have to be aware of challenges. Are Eastern Partnership countries closer to the European Union after 10 years of Eastern Partnership? Not necessarily, and definitely not in the degree that we would have expected. Let me remind you about the conversation between our Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany at the beginning of 2008. The process when we wanted to bring Germany into the support for the Eastern Partnership countries. When we were trying to put the Ukrainian and other countries into the certain perspective membership, and during that conversation, Minister Sikorski was saying about the possible potential membership of Ukraine in the European Union in 2020, which at that time helped us to bring Germany into the positive answer or opinion about the Eastern Partnership. Today we have 2019, and we have not achieved even that. What's more, I mean, Eastern European Partnership definitely lost certain track in the European Union, and to a certain extent it is justified, because European Union is having certain problems internally, like migration, like Brexit. We are having election this year, also internal challenges in the Eastern Partnership countries, and of course, Russia factor. Definitely we need to change this momentum, and Poland is having certain ideas how to do it, but of course that would be a matter of the discussion during the further panels. Let me just conclude on one thing, because I know that we are not talking about the past, but definitely Poland is very much interested in celebrating 10th year anniversary of Eastern Partnership. We definitely should use all available measures to increase visibility of Eastern Partnership countries in the European Union, and definitely to explain significance of close cooperation with Eastern partners within the borders of unified Europe. Just let me close with saying that the special target for us needs to be younger people, and Poland, together with France, Germany, Netherlands, and Sweden, prepared a special project on that, a new deal for the youth of the Eastern Partnership. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both for evoking the NATO Bucharest summit, which I forgot to evoke, and that was a very important element, but also for a bit of a cold shower on the whether the Eastern partners have come closer to the EU or not. And with that, I'd like to try to stimulate some discussion amongst the panel members, and then we will open it up to you. But I would like to address the elephant in the room, and actually there are two elephants in the room. I'd like to address the membership question. Many people, many critics of the Eastern Partnership say that it hasn't produced, the gold standard, which is membership. Ms. Stepanov, could you maybe address that question? Is the Eastern Partnership a failure because membership was not at the end?
Absolutely not. And for Ukraine, membership is not an issue anymore because yesterday the parliament voted for the amendments to the constitution, and whether EU wants or not, Ukraine wants to become a member of the European Union. But actually for Ukraine it have never been a question, and we do not really even consider it as whether a victory or a failure, because we are more oriented so far to so-called quiet integration. We really want to leave the issue of memberships exclusively on a political forum. And nothing really allows us to read differently the specific article of the EU treaty allowing any aspiring country to join the European Union as soon as the criteria are fulfilled. So now we, of course, are focused on fulfilling the criteria, and likely the association agreement, if it is implemented, it makes Ukraine the at least economic member of the European Union. We will become parts of the principal EU markets. We already enjoy the freedom of movement of persons, and then we will go into services, capitals, and goods. So as soon as the agreement implemented, the membership perspective becomes only a political decision. But economically, Ukraine is already moving towards that with this existing framework.
Thank you. Minister, how do you feel about the same question? And tell us also about whether the Eastern Partnership, in your assessment, has helped create more connectivity amongst the countries of the region.
Well, look, I was saying about those various platforms of the European nations working together. The European Union has a great value of developing such norms and standards which contribute to quality development of the nations of the European Union. What we have in our partnership with the European Union is the assessment and application of those norms and standards to advance our development agenda. We have a very strong development agenda today. My government, today, in fact, we're just about maybe have already began the debate in the parliament about the adoption of the new government program, at the heart of which is the economic revolution. And we have spelled out our priorities very clearly, and we're going to implement them. With the European Union, without the European Union, we're going to implement them. This is the challenge and this is the mandate. But with the European Union means applying those important instruments which will amplify our effort, which will help us take our country further in our development agenda. So this is a very important aspect of relationship. At the same time, what is not debatable is that we consider ourselves in the same space, in the same family of European nations. That European identity, with or without the European Union, is with us, has always been with us.
So
we will carry on. It's like putting European Union is 28 member states out of a bigger family of European nations. Not all great nations of Europe are members of the European Union. Not all great nations of Europe are members of the European Union. It's a wonderful family of European nations, at the heart of which is the European identity, at the heart of which is the values and principle. Sticking to it within the European Union, outside the European Union, the challenges to our common shared values have been before us, have been a challenge, and we see it now. Working together towards this, sustaining the European identity, sustaining the values which make this family so great and so important, is our common challenge, our common work. We work together, as I was saying, in our bilateral agenda with the European Union, in our bilateral agenda with the many nations of the European Union, and the Eastern Partnership is one of those fantastic platforms in which we do it together.
Okay.
And promoting this
Okay.
amongst the partners is also a very good
You
thing to do.
skillfully sidestepped my question, but chapeau. I would want to turn to Ambassador Westerholm on addressing the counterfactual then head on.
Yeah.
What would we have done had we had no Eastern Partnership?
Well, I will not claim to be as skillful as the minister, but I will actually try to do the same as him and circumvent a little bit the direct question, because obviously it's impossible to really, define the what-if question. But I would try to comment both on what both of you said, and to just give a few remarks on what we have as a mirror of the counterfactual instead. So what we've seen is, of course, that partner countries today are on a slow but steady process of integration. And integrating with the EU on many levels, and with EU member states, I should say. We see that it's in standards, we see it in processes, we see it in institutions, we see it in trade, and most importantly, I think, which is what you also are referring to, we see it in minds. And this is, this is important. The connection between people, one shouldn't underestimate that this is not the least an important aspect. And the way we discuss today, the way we meet today, the way we know each other, we know each other's needs, we know each other's ambitions, expectations, in a way that we would never have done if it wasn't for the Eastern Partnership. So I'm just giving this as a mirror of the counterfactuals. And I think that one of the most important things is that the younger generations, they will take this for granted. And that, I think, is huge. That's really something to pay attention to and to bear in mind. But again, trying to paint a picture to mirror the counterfactuals, I think maybe the biggest impact of the Eastern Partnership has not maybe happened in the partner countries after all, but actually might be in our member states, in our own countries, and in our minds. And that is that we are slowly but surely getting rid of the notion of post-Soviet states. That we in the European Union today, we do not first and foremost define our Eastern neighbors by their past, but that we actually today, that we discuss and let's face it, we quarrel a lot about partner countries' future relationship with the European Union. And again, to mirror the counterfactual, I think that the biggest difference, I'm convinced, is that today we regard our Eastern neighbors unquestionably as European countries. And that, to pinpoint the counterfactual, we would not have discussed the 6 partner countries as European countries, was it not for the Eastern Partnership.
Excellent point. Excellent point. It's a two-way street, certainly, and our representative from Ukraine made the point as well that initiatives in the Eastern Partnership policy have come also from the partner countries, not just from Brussels in one direction, and that's something very important to keep in mind. Ambassador Kozlowski, often when people talk about the Eastern Partnership and the positives or the kind of accomplishments in the last 10 years, they point to the agreements, the DCFTAs, the association agreements, any sort of visa liberalization, facilitation. These are bilateral aspects. What about the regional? What about the regional side? Is the Eastern Partnership, it's greater than the sum of its bilateral and multilateral parts, or do we really focus inordinately a lot on the bilateral? How would you assess it?
Thank you very much for that question. I mean, the assumption of Eastern Partnership was bilateral in nature, because we created a mechanism in which one size doesn't fit for all. So for some of the countries were having pro-European aspirations, some of them not, and it is up to them to choose a path which way to go. Let me remind you of one of the documents, European Union documents, which was stipulating clearly that the EU is committed to having strong, differentiated, mutually beneficial cooperation with all 6 EaP partners, whatever the individual level of ambition in their relations with the EU. Since there are different levels of ambitions, it's difficult sometimes to talk about the common outputs. But let me put the 2 caveats in it, because of course Poland is trying also to find some common denominator in these activities. First of all, we definitely stimulate and encourage partner countries to make a common position. Let me remind you recently about the common or joint position of Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine with regard to maintaining a separate European neighborhood instrument. And also second, we are having, of course, the sectoral cooperation in which, especially in transport, energy, or roaming, we need to have different approach. I mean, having this much more integrated approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with that, I would now turn to you, the audience. This is your chance to pose questions to our panelists. I already see several. So, Kristi, would you like to start? Then you will be next. And please, third. Go ahead, Kristi. Please identify yourselves and your affiliation before speaking.
Kristi Raik, Estonian Foreign Policy Institute at ICDS. And thank you. First a comment and then a question. My comment is that we have heard a lot this morning the word transformation, but we have heard much less the word security. And the reason is obvious. The EU is quite good at supporting transformation. That is at the heart of the Eastern Partnership policy. The EU has experience there, but the EU is much less good at dealing with security issues in the neighborhood. But of course, we are all aware that the security environment and the geopolitical context has become much more difficult, to put it mildly. So my question is, how do you assess the little steps that the EU has been taking in the past years to bring more attention to security and the resilience of the Eastern Partnership countries? The Ukrainian speaker mentioned hybrid threats and propaganda. So what is it that the EU can do to actually help the region deal with the security situation, and not just transformation, which, in the long term you can argue that it brings more security, but in the short term, when you don't have security, it's much more difficult to do reforms. Thank you.
Thank you. Please. So we'll take a bunch of questions and then we'll go to the answers.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Andrei Sannikov. I come from Belarus, today living in Poland. And I have unfortunately, I have to speak about the failures of Eastern Partnership policy, because as regards Belarus, first of all, I remember the discussions before the Eastern Partnership was ushered 10 years ago, and I remember that I voiced my concerns that, first of all, it will be seen as a geopolitical provocation by Russia. And the only answer to that was to invest into values, and here I agree completely with our Ukrainian friends that that was needed from the Eastern Partnership. Unfortunately, I'm the object of this policy of failures. When the European Union decided to work with authoritarian and dictatorial regimes instead of civil society, instead of societies, instead of people. I was running against Lukashenko in 2010. I was running on a platform of European Belarus civil campaign, and I'm still leading this campaign. And unfortunately, the understanding of European Union at that time in 2010 was that with a minimal transparency during the election, and with the support of Lukashenko towards this transparency, something could be achieved. Instead, we got the most violent crackdown in Belarus. Instead, I went in prison, and I have to live in exile now. And I see, unfortunately, that the same mistakes are being repeated. The same mistakes. At that time, one of the architects of Eastern Partnership policy, Radek Sikorsky, came to Minsk, and he clearly said to us that Lukashenko would win in any case. Nothing will happen. We will work with him. Forget about your ambitions. You don't have a single candidate. He repeated all the cliches that we're hearing all these 25 years, not 10 years of Eastern Partnership. And so, in other words, we were denied even the attention that we needed at that time. I remember that in 2009, we're speaking about the past, Lukashenko was disinvited to the Prague summit, although he was issued the official invitation. Now we're having invitation for Lukashenko that he ignored in 2018 for the summit. So all these years we were moving towards recognition of the dictatorship. And the same policy of the appeasement is continued as regards Belarus. Why I mentioned this campaign, presidential campaign of 2010? Because European Union and Brussels doesn't want to understand that we are fighting for European values in Belarus, not the regime.
Andrei, could I ask you to bring
I thought I'm okay, the question is...
I'm going to cut you off otherwise.
The question is that I think I have to warn you. It's not a question, it's a warning, and the question may be to the Polish ambassador, that every step towards appeasement of dictatorship helps the regime, helps Kremlin, in Belarus I mean, and destroys the spirit of the society. And the question to the Polish ambassador is that Poland is about to take an unprecedented step of recognition of the regime. On Monday, the head of unlawful upper chamber of Lukashenko's parliament is coming to Poland and being met by all the top officials, president, prime minister, two speakers of parliament, and minister of foreign affairs. I know that every such step of legitimization of the regime is followed by more repression in Belarus. According to the human rights organization in Belarus, nothing happened and the situation is coming back. So why it is it agreed with Brussels? What is the purpose of this kind of, again, unprecedented gesture? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andrei. And we first met when you were running for president and under kind of interesting circumstances. I remember the time very well. So the first question was on the EU's role in security in the Eastern Partnership. Andrei Sanikov's question was to the Polish ambassador, but others feel free to respond as well to the question of whether the EU is making the same mistake again now. And now we have a question from Georgia.
Good morning.
And please try to keep
yes, very short
concise.
Question. So first of all, I have to commend that Eastern Partnership has brought very positive results to every partner, I'm sure, and also to the EU. But here I would like to mention one thing. It was a project with a great vision, with great goals, and with financial support. You mentioned in the beginning that there was a change in the financial framework, and certain money was allocated, and I'm quoting you, it was decisive for the success of Eastern Partnership. So what we see now, after 10 years, there is a reform of the financial framework, and we don't see any specific allocation for Eastern Partnership. There are only two baskets, one general for the whole world, support of the EU to the whole world, and a specific basket for countries in the process of accession. So how we should interpret this action from the European side? This is question to you and question to member states. Thank you.
Okay, I'll use my, exploit my position here, having the microphone to answer the last question first. When the Eastern Partnership was created, as I said, a separate pot of money was set aside for the Eastern to support the program and the bilateral programs, both the regional and bilateral. And this was, I continue to think it was decisive because it separated this pot of money to the degree that it was 2/3 for the rest of the neighborhood, 1/3 for the Eastern Partnership, which was pretty good under those circumstances. What I would say to you on the current discussions is that was a Commission proposal from the European Commission, which is now being discussed by the member states. And it's a long discussion, and it's far from over. And there are many, many member states who completely agree with you that the funding for the Eastern Partnership should be ring-fenced. So keep your eye on this space. I think this will develop quite a bit before it's agreed. But back now to our panel with the two questions. So the first one on security, the second one on appeasement or behavior. Please.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for those questions. I would start with the first one, which is what the European Union could do with regard to the Eastern Partnership countries. How would react, what kind of political activities multilateral or bilateral could do. I think that we can perceive it on 3 dimensions. I mean, first of all, on this big political picture. First of all, definitely we need to keep the sanctions regime vis-à-vis Russian Federation, and we need to keep in unity within the European Union countries. And I think this is something what is very important to repeat that every second month. And we are seeing, at least from some of the countries, certain, I would say, appetite for a rapprochement with Russia, partially on economic grounds, partially on the other. Definitely, until Russia will never take the position vis-à-vis Minsk agreement, will not change their behavior, we definitely need to continue the sanctions regime. At the same time, we need to be vocal vis-à-vis the United States, definitely to present them the situation. And this is especially responsibility on the eastern flank of NATO countries, because Congress, the new Congress with the Democrats, need to hear what is really going on between Ukraine and Russia, between Georgia and Russia, between other countries. So those definitely are tasks among us to keep them aware, to keep the White House and the Congress aware. Second dimension would be, of course, our policy internally in the European Union. And on one hand, of course, we are very strong and united with regard to the sanctions. But on the other hand, definitely there are certain decisions among countries which are not necessarily with a positive implications. And let me give you an example of Nord Stream 2, which is a clear example to the detriment of the Ukrainian policy. And definitely internally in Brussels and multilaterally, we need to avoid such policies which would harm directly our Eastern Partnership countries. And the third dimension would be, of course, continuing support for the countries internally, for their reforms, administrative reforms, education reforms, continuing development, continuing the assistance to those countries. This is something definitely we need to do day by day. Also vis-à-vis economic support discussion with IMF, the World Bank, some kind of economic assistance, continuation of those. This is also our task. With regard to the second question, I would disagree with the statement that our level of cooperation with Belarus is an unprecedented one. Definitely not, because we are having strong opinion on the government of Belarus, and I'm not seeing any unprecedented movements with regard to the political cooperation with Belarus. Of course, there is an economic dimension and the people-to-people dimension. And of course, we would like to pursue economic cooperation with Belarus, and also people-to-people, because if you take a look on the number of migrants coming to Poland recently, Poland is in fact #1 with regard to the receiving of migrants from other countries outside of the European Union. Most of them are Ukrainians, but number two is Belarusians, close to 300,000 Belarusians within the last 2 years, and we are very, very pleased with that project. But this, of course, creates certain room for a discussion, both in Minsk and in Warsaw. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who else would like to tackle the security question? Anna, you do want to say? Okay, everybody wants to tackle it. Very good. So, Anna, why don't you start and then...
Just two quick responses to both the issue on security resilience and maybe also on the Belarusian, or should I divide them? Just very quickly on security and resilience. You mentioned at the end of your comment that the short-term and the long-term perspective. I think that's a very important distinction. Obviously, the Eastern Partnership is not a security tool in that respect. If you talk about or define security only in terms of military cooperation or hard security or armed forces. So security and resilience, when we discuss it, is quite often understood only in those terms, that is in the NATO terms. But actually security and resilience, as you also alluded to yourself, is much broader. It's the institutions, it's transparency, it's the absence of corruption, it's educational level of people, it's engaged citizens, it's, I would say at the core of it, is public trust in government and institutions. Resilience is economic, resilience is climate. So when we talk about security and resilience, we should have a much more broad perspective on it than just those hard defense issues. Then, of course, hybrid threats is part of this discussion. Our tools in the hard security area are limited, of course. This is not in our toolbox. But in the broader toolbox that we have, we are already working on long-term security, which is in all those other fields of society. When it comes to Belarus, just mention quickly, you say values, and of course this is the basis for our cooperation with the Eastern Partnership. Now, a few points just to make. The European Union has to make agreements government to government. It has to make agreements with the government. We have to talk with the government. We have to have a channel. Otherwise, we cannot give those hard messages that we need to give. We don't do dictators instead of civil society and people. We speak with heads of government, heads of states, and administrations, and we speak with and support people and civil society. And being a Swede, I know you know our portfolio in Belarus is quite extensive, and it's very much focused on cooperation with and support to civil society, and also promoting fundamental values and principles. And this is also what we talk about when we talk with the government. So I just wanted to make that very clear, that it's not an either-or issue here. We are always engaging with governments, and this is the only way we could also engage with civil society. And I think that's an important distinction to make.
Yeah, I think that's important as well to make, because as one of my former bosses said to me once, the EU is an inveterate engager. We engage with everybody, and we hope for the best, but we also combine dialogue with critical engagement vis-a-vis, for instance, DPRK, dialogue plus some other more sharply honed tools for like sanctions or like whatever. So this is a policy that is often used, and it's also used vis-a-vis Belarus. Okay, security still, yeah.
Yeah, just a very small comment. I want to once again very much agree with the ambassador that security issues are going far, far beyond the military cooperation solely. And actually, it is very important so far because hybrid threats, cyber attacks, surveillance cooperation is not something hidden. Actually, after 2014 and all the hybrid attacks and propaganda and disinformation we all face around the world, not only in Ukraine, many things that were just something about the spy games in a very well-known Hollywood movies. This is not something which is not the secret services anymore. Everything that we were not on a surface is now open. We have social media, we have Facebook, Google, and etc., and YouTube, the information you can get immediately, as well as you can disseminate and spread information. And this is recently new threats, new attacks that we face, new challenges that all the world faces. And the best medicine which was found by European Union to tackle this issue is to protect cybersecurity, to exchange information, knowledges, and the faster, the more effective you exchange and spread information among partners, the more protected you are. That's why, looking back to all the initiatives within Eastern Partnership, we believe that this is the timely one, actually, to build on our joint cooperation and exchange of information, how to tackle security issues related to propaganda, disinformation, and cyber attacks.
Thank you very much, Minister.
Thank you very much. I think I'm very much in tune with what Anna Westerholm and Olga Stefanishina were saying. The proposed question was about a balance between transformation and security. For us, European Union, relations within Europe has been a very fundamental part of our security architecture. Security in its broader context. The strength and resilience of our national institutions is a security arrangement. The strength of our public, of our society, as it was in April, May, to secure stability was a matter of security. It's a broader context. I always insisted and made this point that in the case of Armenia, democracy is not just simply a question of a choice of a political system. It's a security question. And there is another interesting way of looking at it, security, as we're having a very interesting debate, the other balance between values and realpolitik. I think with the European Union, you think I sidestepped the question, but in fact I do focus on one important thing, the capacity to work for Armenia with the European Union and with the nations of Europe on the very pragmatic approach, on pragmatic dialogue and relationship to strengthen those aspects of our security architecture which matter to us so much. So values and realpolitik, they are challenged in all directions. You know, Armenia is in a difficult security condition. But with the European Union, we have been capable in a very careful dialogue, in a very careful construction of a very solid relationship to strengthen and consolidate what is important to Armenia. So, you know, the question of realpolitik and values is a difficult one in that, look, there are energy security matters, right, which require an approach of realpolitik. There are questions in which, as I was saying, in our case, the limitations of our access to the European markets is a question also of the way in which with the European Union and with other partners we address the question of those limitations. And there is this difficult question of realpolitik versus values. So complexity of security arrangement.
I hate to interrupt you, Minister, but we're getting close on time, and in fact, there is no, that's a false dichotomy to draw a distinction between realpolitik and values. Our values are part of our security DNA, and they should not, they're inseparable, in fact.
I'm exactly challenging that dilemma. This is what I'm
But there's no dilemma. That's the thing. There's no dilemma.
No, the point is that we insist there is no dilemma. But we also have to face it, that it is not a consensus that there is no dilemma. We have to insist there is no dilemma.
Okay, this is another sidestep, but very good. Please, we have I think, time for one more question, please.
Thank you, Chairman. James Sher, Estonian Foreign Policy Institute. I think my colleagues understand perfectly well that the Eastern Partnership does not belong in the hard power business, but there is a wider need for more precision and concreteness about what areas of security the Eastern Partnership is dealing with and proposes to deal with. And if I may mention one that NATO does not deal with and cannot possibly deal with, but which is critical, it's law enforcement. When the war in Ukraine started in Donbass in 2014, the Ukrainian authorities suddenly then discovered, only after Yanukovych left, that for months, if not years, the Russian Federation had been topping the salaries of law enforcement people in those raioni and oblasti. This is a critical area for all Eastern Partnership countries. Who are the real actors making decisions? What are the real sources of funding? If the Eastern Partnership is unwilling to consider this, then one has a right to question whether it is really addressing real security problems amongst its members. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who would like to tackle that question? The question being, is the Eastern Partnership in a position to tackle that sort of thing, law enforcement? Please.
I just want to stress out, on a very important moment, that once again I completely agree with this statement, which really confirms the fact that nothing is hidden anymore. Everything is obvious, and something we could not even imagine about what have been done by Russian surveillance services in the course of the last 20 years in Ukraine. Everything is open now. The same goes not only to Ukraine, to any country. And the more open we are in terms of exchanging this data and bringing it public, the less influence and suffrage we can see from those external partners wanting to undermine our values and nations.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Westerholm, you want to
Just
tackle?
very quickly. I don't remember the number of the paragraph right now, but if we can all look back to the summit declaration from Brussels, there is a paragraph on security, which was much more elaborated than any other text before at summit level. Now that is just a paragraph, but in reality what that means that it gives instructions to us to operationalize down, the layers. So we have a clear instruction from our heads of states and governments now of 28 plus 6 to work in a number of areas which are definitely hard security related, apart from, of course, real defense and real military. And within these, we have law enforcement, we have radicalization, we have integrated border management, we have disinformation and propaganda, we have anti-trafficking, anti-corruption, and a number of other issues. So it's there. And maybe it's not massive, maybe it's not as publicly discussed and showed as many of the other issues that we keep discussing, but it's definitely there, and we are developing it, yes.
And that's an innovation that dates from the time of the Riga summit and was developed a bit more in the Brussels declaration.
Correct. Thank you.
So it's ongoing, but it's kind of below the radar screen, which is sometimes the way we should like to keep it.
Yes.
For reasons. Good. Thank you very much. Where are we after this panel? We've discussed membership perspective, sort of. We've discussed both of the elephants in the room. We have talked about whether the Eastern Partnership in the last 10 years has brought us closer to each other, if that's possible. We've talked about identity issues, about the Eastern Partnership as a platform, and also as a two-way street, that the partnership has not only brought about sort of deep, profoundly political transformation by way of boring regulatory harmonization, but it's also changed our identities and our ways of looking both at the Eastern partners and the Eastern partners' ways of looking at us. And that's not bad for 10 years. So please join me in thanking this panel for a great start to this conference.